Good afternoon. Today, I'd like to talk to you about what I've learned about being on the road, figuratively, literally, professionally, in my time as an expat from the UK. When I started preparing for this talk, as Anna's just alluded to, my background is in literature, language, and history. And so I decided to revisit some of the roads that I'd gone down previously in order to give me some inspiration. And what I was struck by was the frequency, the amount of times that this concept of being on the road, of journeying, of travel, or roads themselves had cropped up in my life up to that point. So, for example, I studied classics and Latin at a school that was built on Roman roads and an amphitheatre, and I knew that the empire had built its success on the quality of its road network. The Silk Roads and spice routes had obviously allowed trade to flourish, but also they'd allowed language, culture, beliefs to spread. In many ways, they were the basis for civilization to grow. The road brings progress. More recently, the advent of the railroads revolutionized industry and the world in the late 19th century. Development. In the early 20th century, the mass production of the motor car was a byword for development and improvement. And so the image of being on the road was central to this idea of development, progress, momentum. Then in the middle years of the 20th century, the roads become a little bit darker, as the roads to concentration camps and the gas chambers are a recurring theme in Holocaust narratives of that time. A little bit after that, the American president is assassinated, literally on the road in one of its own cities. And the void that he leaves is filled by 4 young men from Liverpool who also go on the road and bring Beatlemania, a global phenomenon of mass hysteria, to the broader world, defining a culture, a generation, and a decade. And so I even thought about the internet. And when the internet first arrived, its alternative name was the information superhighway, which is, of course, nothing but a very, very fast road. And so road was everywhere. I then thought about literature. And some of the most important texts in Western literature use the road as an image or a symbol. For example, I was thinking about Sophocles in the Oedipus Rex, Dante's Inferno, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Just 4 of the canonical texts that make use of the road as an image or a symbol for life, for human existence, the human condition. And there are thousands more. And then, of course, there's the connotations, the illusions of being on the road. The traveling circus or fair, traveling theatre company, the promise of the carnivalesque and excitement, escape, and just the whiff of danger. Of course, then there's also the cowboy, the vagabond, the highwayman, the rock and roll band. Here today and gone tomorrow, starting again and leaving the past behind. Rebirth, refresh, it can all be found on the road. And then I thought about language, the language that we use. And this idea of being on the road is obviously linked to momentum. Think about it. You might have seen the signs outside. You might be on the road to stardom. You might be on the road to failure. You might be on the road to wisdom, to success. Maybe you're even on the road to nowhere. But whatever road you're traveling down, you're going there with purpose and with speed. You've got a destination. And then equally, we've got the idiomatic expressions of crossroads, fork in the roads, decision-making. And so it seemed to me that tied up in this very idea of the road was the idea of decision-making, progress, travel, and momentum. In Middle English, the word road means journey. And by Shakespeare's time, the word road had come to mean a way to travel between 2 places. And it struck me when I researched that in fact that's why, throughout the ages, the road had been used as a metaphor for life and human existence. Take your 2 places, birth and death, growth and decay. And the journey that we have to travel on in between those, however long or however short. And so it was a perfect fit, it seemed, and that perhaps explains its enduring appeal to be used as a metaphor for life. And so all of this stuff that I was thinking about, I started to think about my own life, physically being on the road. And I started to think about the routes that I'd taken. And what I realized was that, in fact, my life had not been one long, continuous road, but a series of routes that I'd chosen. And those routes had taken me in different directions, some of them successful, some of them not so successful, some of them chosen, but oftentimes not chosen. And actually, I realized that I'd learned more from those things that I didn't choose, or perhaps that weren't successful. And so I started to think about this idea of roots bringing me to Ho Chi Minh City and the life that I live now, in the job that I do now, with the family that I have now. And it seemed to me that it couldn't really have been any other way. That was my journey. That was the road that I was on. And thinking about the routes I'd taken in research, in life, in love, made me think of the other routes. The routes about where you're from, what your values are, where you grew from. Same sound, different word. Roots and roots. And what I thought was interesting was the idea of route, the path, is taken from the Latin rupta, which means to break. It's where we get the word rupture. And so I found a pleasing linguistic link between this idea of being on the road, following routes that I'd chosen, and the fact that I was getting further away from the routes from which I'd started. And this to me was quite an interesting idea. This idea of breakage was inherent in the relationship between the roots and the roots. I was aware of some sort of break within myself. I was aware of some sort of rupture between where I was now and where I'd started out from, my root and my roots. And no doubt this became particularly sharp in focus due to the fact that I have recently become a father to a beautiful baby son. And therefore, I started to think about my road and my roots and his road. And I started to wonder how I would reconcile myself to the fact that my son would grow up in a city without family roots and without a past. And I started to think about this in quite a lot of detail. And so my son's mother and myself are from the northwest of England. It's where our family still live. And we find ourselves in Ho Chi Minh City. And although we visit every summer, I started to really kind of feel that I was an imposter when I returned home, that I didn't really belong. And I had to try and get my head around the fact that my son was not going to know anything about those roots other than a 6-week holiday every summer. And so I started to think about his roots, my parents' roots, my grandparents' roots. And I thought that it was a really interesting connection. Both of my grandfathers spent their lives on the road. One was a long-distance truck driver, and before that, he was a seaman, constantly traveling on the sea, on the road, to and from home. My other grandfather was a scaffolder, always moving from job to job as they completed, on the road, from site to site. My father was a market trader, and so a large part of our family business was going on the road every morning, setting up, doing the business, breaking down, and then going home again on the road. And so I started to think about the values of those three men, the values of my father and my two grandfathers, and the values that they'd instilled in me. And in many ways, my education had given me a road out of scaffolding, out of long-distance truck driving, out of market trading. But the values that I took with me of hard work and discipline and engagement were instilled in me by those men. And so I started to think about how I could instill those values in my own son. And so my son was born in a city where he's got no family other than his parents. He's got no history other than the 2 weeks that he's been here. And he's a very, very long way geographically from where his grandfathers started out, and a very long way socioeconomically. And so I started to question what my roots would mean to my son. And yes, there are echoes of all of those things I've just spoken about in this city. I see scaffolding everywhere, I see construction trucks, and obviously the city's markets. And they trigger echoes of memories in me, but they'll mean nothing to my son. And so I thought about what had been gained and what had been lost in this journey along our road. All things being well, our son will probably grow up with all of the material trappings and privilege that his grandfathers could only have dreamt of. My grandmother was a cleaner. My family now employ a cleaner. And so in some ways, I suppose, this branch of our family tree has progressed, this idea of development, of growth, being on the road. And yet I wondered whether my son would ever really grasp any of those things. And indeed, what difference would it make to us if he did or he didn't? And I don't know the answer to that question yet. It'll depend on many factors. And I suppose as parents, it'll be our job to instill some of those values and roots and the awareness of the importance of those. But how effectively we do so remains to be seen. But isn't that part of the allure of the road, the journey, the finding out? And I suppose that my current role as a university guidance counsellor has also made me think about this particular area in a little bit more detail. I find myself advising young people who are about to go out on the road, to college, to another country, to adulthood, and all that lies beyond. That idea of growth, of travel. And so these intelligent and mature young people that I work with are often dislocated from their roots and their cultures. And many are the much referred to third culture kids. Now, they're at the other end of the childhood road to my son. But equally, they're at the stage now where they're very much focused on a destination. The end of the IB road, the start of the college road, a real shift as they take routes and make breaks away from their families. From the tight-knit communities of BIS Ho Chi Minh City to being smaller fish in much bigger pools. And of course, at the moment, it seems that where they go is so incredibly important, that destination. And yet being on the road has taught me that, in fact, it's the route that is more important than any particular road. Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that life must be lived forwards but only understood backwards. And I think that's a fine observation for anybody who finds themselves on a literal or figurative road. Often, I've taken roads in my life thinking I was going in one particular direction when actually it was taking me somewhere else. But I didn't see that at the time. Of course, I couldn't. And now I'm really glad that I followed my instinct and chose to make those choices that I did at the time. The life that I live now bears no relation to the life that my 18-year-old self might have imagined. And I'm pleased about that, because at 18, I didn't know enough, I didn't see enough, I hadn't heard enough to be able to plan my life effectively. And when I think about the students now, they're the same. How can they know what their future holds for them, for their families, for their lives? And so the further you go, the less you really do know. And what I've seen from where I am today is that despite many of the young people I work with being dislocated from their culture, their international outlook renders them open to the opportunities and sliding doors that life delivers. The routes available to them are diverse and brilliant, and they're not bound or restricted by a parochial attitude or a fear of change. And it's a great thing to see. Being an international citizen is about being on the road in the same way as life. Opportunity, progress, growth. And from being on the road myself for a long time, what I know is that this next destination will probably only be a stepping stone, as lots of my destinations have been along my road. But they'll learn that from themselves. It's a lesson learned on the road. And in order to make the most of the opportunities that present themselves on the road, there needs to be that fearlessness. It's about following your instincts, following the route that appeals to you at that particular time. And where else could that instinct come from but your roots, where you're from, who you are, and what your values are? The courage to trust what you feel inside, the courage to follow a drive or passion and move forward with it. That's the key. Because like any good quest narrative, the epiphany or revelation at arriving at your destination will only pose further questions to be answered, roads taken and routes chosen. The further you go, the less you know. Thank you for listening.